Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. We start out in the Kursk direction where the Ukrainians have advanced here to the northwest of their incursion. They are trying to reconquer Snagorsk, which the Ukrainians first managed to gain control of. Since then the Russians regained control of it, and now the Ukrainians are fighting over it again with a foothold within the village, and fighting is ongoing within it. Further north in the direction of Kornevo, the Russians have been pushed back towards the town itself, where the Ukrainians have managed to gain control over the village here to the north. With the river line between the Russian and Ukrainian positions, the Ukrainians have a significant foothold here in the area, which allows them to launch operations in the direction of Kornevo. So we see that the Ukrainians are here trying to establish a strong enough position here along the river lines to the south and to the north to launch their full attention towards Kornevo itself in an attempt to gain control over the town. The Ukrainians have held control over this chain of villages since the very first 2 days of the offensive incursion, which has now lasted more than a week. This has allowed them to consolidate their gains in this area and develop offensive operations further in a northwestern direction. At the same time, thanks to Syriac maps coming up with the idea, we can now map out the Ukrainian DRG activity differently than the actual advances by the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians have launched deep reconnaissance groups deep into Russian lines through the forest areas in between the villages and Russian positions to reach the rear of the Russian positions. This advance here was geolocated with a Ukrainian vehicle being destroyed here in the northern edges of it. So we see that the Ukrainians have active deep reconnaissance activity here in the northern parts beyond that of the villages. So they do not have control over these villages. They instead have gone in between them to reach the deep end of the front line. Similarly, in the east, the Ukrainians also have some DRG activity in this area here. So the whole area is marked as an area where the Ukrainians have a presence, but doesn't have control of the area. And again, there is further geolocated footage of Ukrainians being ambushed and being attacked here in this section of the front line, which shows that the Ukrainians do have a presence there, but it is not a strong presence and it's not an active presence. The way I differentiate it is based on what sort of footage we see. We can see footage of a few vehicles near a forest area or driving through a village, which typically coming from the Russian side also follows up with FPV strikes, artillery strikes, or an ambush. Then they do not have control of the area, but they have a presence there. If there's a video of Ukrainians walking around in a town or building fortifications, or generally that they are not on the move but standing still, then they typically have some sort of control over that area, and that is when the map changes. Kursk's claim of the Ukrainians controlling 1,000 square kilometers and Zelensky's claim of the Ukrainians controlling 78 villages in the Kursk region both correspond with the DRG reconnaissance areas being included in the areas that the Ukrainians control. However, I do not agree with that assessment, and therefore my map is like this and their speech is like that. Now, a very interesting topic to completely dive into repeatedly is, as the topic of this New York Times article, what exactly is the objective of the Ukrainian offensive? We see that right here. What is the goal of Ukraine's incursion? Analysts say that Ukraine's offensive most likely has two main aims: draw Russian forces from the front lines in eastern Ukraine and seize territory that could serve as a bargaining chip in future peace talks. The operation could also offer a much-needed morale boost for Ukrainians whose forces have been losing ground to Russian troops for months. However, military analysts have questioned whether Kiev's cross-border assault is worth the risk, given that Ukrainian forces are already stretched on the front lines of their own country, including suffering from shortages of troops and ammunition. Now let's go over these claims one by one. Draw Russian forces from the front lines in eastern Ukraine. That is something that has not been reached at all. The only Russian brigade pulled from the east or south is from the Chasiv Yar direction, which is the 810th Marine Brigade, which was relocated to the north. However, they the brigade itself was just recently relocated to Chasiv Yar, where it didn't get to initiate any offensive operations in that direction and didn't participate in the fighting prior to it being rotated back to the north. And at the same time, the Ukrainians diverted one brigade of their own, the 80th Brigade, from Chasiv Yar and to the Kursk region. So both sides have diverted one brigade from Chasiv Yar to the north. Other than that, not a single Russian brigade from the east and south has been rotated to the north. This indicates that the Russians and the Ukrainians have rediverted equal amount of troops to the north, which indicates that this objective is not being met at all. Instead, the Russians are mainly responding with their reserves within Kursk itself. They also mentioned the objective of rotating troops from the east to the north, or forcing the Russians to do so, would be to lessen the pressure in the east. Yet we saw yesterday that the Russians have captured a massive amount of territory from east of New York and northeast of New York of the 2014 line of defense, indicating further Russian advances in the area. And in the Pokrovsk direction, we today see the Russians capturing Svyrodunivka and reaching the outskirts of Novotoretsk, as well as capturing several lines of Ukrainian defensive positions west of Ivanivka. They have now managed to gain a foothold in Hrudivka. But this shows a massive 11 square kilometer advance of the Russians here east of Hrudivka, gaining full control over the fortified positions. This is at the heights located east of Hrudivka, while the Ukrainians still have fortified positions in the heights west of Hrudivka and along Krychyi Yar and to the north of Novohrudivka, as long as the third line of defense located here between Hrudivka and Novokrenka. The Russians are now in a position with the capture of Shelane, the final parts of that town, has led the Russians to be in a position where they will continue their offensive operations further along the railways, attack in the direction of Mykolaiivka, and to gain control over the villages here in the low grounds by simply gaining control over the fortified positions to the east of them, and then moving along towards a push towards Novohrudivka and the fortified positions to the south, overlooking Selidove, that is located also in the low grounds. Taking a look at the topographic map gives us a better overview. This is Hrudivka. The fortified positions to the east of it, located at the heights, have been captured by the Russians, and to the west of it there are several heights where the Ukrainian fortified positions are located. Hrudivka itself is located in the low grounds. Similar to Siversk, there will unlikely be any Russian incursions into it. They'll instead fight along the high grounds along the railways, where they'll go through Novohrudivka and move along that to push through the Ukrainian fortified positions head on through the high ground, and again moving down south, Mykolaiivka, the different areas here to the south, gaining full control over the high grounds east of Selidove. Then through the push along the high ground, they can then move on to fight the Ukrainian fortified positions and flank the villages where there is no real Ukrainian presence either way. This has, with the Russian push to gain control over the northern parts, they have secured the northern flank, with them having control over the high grounds and now also the general area, preventing the Ukrainians from launching any significant counterattack in that direction. So they can now concentrate their forces in the high grounds and in the fortified areas, where they can push through the Ukrainian fortifications and gain control over more high ground, which will allow them to flank the Ukrainian positions in the low ground. Mapping that out, the Russians have moved along the low grounds, capturing the final fortified positions in the heights east of Hrudivka, gain control over the northern flank, which will secure the northern flank and prevent the Ukrainians from launching attacks from Hrudivka, as they would have to pass through the low grounds against fortified positions held by the Russians. And therefore the Russians will now be able to relocate forces from the north towards Serhivka and Shelane, which they've recently captured, to then push along the railways towards Mykolaiivka to the south, Novohrudivka to the west, and Orelivka to the north, gaining control over all of the fortified positions in this area, and then pushing down south along the fortified positions towards the east of Selidove, located at the heights, and along Novohrudivka towards the flank of Hrudivka to fight over the fortified positions on the third line of defense, just ahead of Pokrovsk. So we're seeing that the Russians will likely do a repeat of the push from Pokrovsk towards Serhivka, from Serhivka towards Novohrudivka, and then from Novohrudivka to the rear towards Mirnograd, Pokrovsk, and the third line of defense. This means that the Ukrainian Kursk offensive has failed in the east as well. Now this puts up to the next one, which is a seized territory that could serve as a bargaining chip in the future peace talks. However, the fact that the Russians are using their reserves to hold back their offensive. If the Russians are able to stabilize the front with these reserves without having to redirect additional forces, this would mean that the Ukrainians would be in a position where they would have to dig in and turn to the defense. And if they're turning to the defense, then the Russians will be able to continue the offensive operations unhampered in the east, leading to further control over that area. If the Russians gain control over the east, in the Donetsk region, they'll be able to free up a lot of soldiers, because if we take a look at the population density of the Donetsk region, it is 157 people per square kilometer. Compared to that, the Kursk region is just 36 people per square kilometer, which shows that the population density and the density of residential areas, which are more difficult to push through than open fields, are much higher in the east than it is in the north. Not to mention that there are several larger towns and cities like Pokrovsk, Konstantinivka, Kramatorsk, Sloviansk, and so on in the Donetsk region, while in the Kursk region there really isn't anything other than Kursk itself. Kursk city has a population of about 400,000 people compared to Donetsk city having over 1 million people. So we see that there is a vast difference in the amount of people living in each of the areas. This also means at the same time as there is this heavy fortified areas in the Donetsk region compared to Kursk being only lightly fortified along the border areas, shows that the value of the territory militarily between Kursk and Donetsk is vastly different. Politically, it's about the same, but this means that it will be difficult for Ukraine to hold on to any territory it controls in the Kursk region, especially since they, for the majority, have to dig in themselves, and 2 days old fortifications is completely incomparable to 10-year-old fortifications in the Donetsk region. Therefore, any territory the Russians gain in the Donetsk region is worth more militarily than territory gained in the Kursk region. At the same time, the question arises, will the Ukrainians even be able to hold on to their territory? Time will tell, because we do not know exactly what their plan is. Will they be able to establish proper defensive lines? Will they be able to consolidate their gains? Will they be able to expand further? How much are they going to be able to hold on to? And all of that adds up to answer this question. So what can we say about this goal? It's inconclusive. The morale boost itself seems to be inconclusive as well. According to my sources in Ukraine, normal foot soldiers and civilians seem to be uplifted by this offensive, seeing that they are getting some sort of revenge and seeing that they're able to strike back and having some successful military operations has raised the morale of some, while any officer or military commander seems to be very more skeptical and less happy about it, considering, again, exactly what this article says. Military analysts have questions whether Kiev's cross-border assault is worth the risk, given that Ukrainian forces are already stretched on the front lines of their own country, including suffering from shortages of troops and ammunition. The Ukrainians already have shortages of troops and ammunition. This means that the commanders commanding these troops with the lack of, troops and ammunition makes it difficult for them to see the purpose of this operation, especially since the Russian soldiers are not being diverted to the north. There is nothing to gain for the eastern soldiers. What happens in the northern soldiers? Therefore, based on the goals announced by New York Times and the goals expected by me and most military analysts, the offensive so far is inconclusive. We'll have to see how it develops in the next few weeks to the next months, as that is the terms of this offensive. It's going to be something that has to continue for months if the Ukrainians want to gain anything from it. And based on that, we'll have to see how it develops, because right now there's no conclusive evidence for it being a very good decision or a very bad decision. What we do know is that the Ukrainians have committed a lot of troops and the Russians are responding with their reserves. So it is a battle of reserves, not a battle of frontline soldiers. This means that the situation in the east has not changed at all, and that is evident with how the Russians have progressed this past week, exactly as they used to prior to the Kursk offensive. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, and check out my Patreon for additional content. Thank you all for watching, and have a great day.